The crack of thunder rolled across the endless prairie as Theodora Zimmerman clutched her black morning dress tightly against her trembling frame. 6 months a widow, and the whispers still followed her like vultures circling overhead. Whispers that her husband's death had been no accident, whispers that she had blood on her delicate hands. Drenched from the sudden downpour, she slipped through the back door of Redemption's only church, seeking sanctuary from both the storm and the suspicious glares of townsfolk who once called her friend. The year was 1878, and Redemption, Colorado, was a town balanced precariously between the lawlessness of the frontier and the promise of civilization. Theodora Thea, to those who once cared for her, had arrived 3 years prior as a hopeful bride. Now, at 25, she was alone with nothing but her husband's debts and the weight of undeserved suspicion. Rain pounded against the stained glass windows as Thea made her way through the empty church. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her sodden boots. She hadn't planned to come here, but when the storm hit, and she found herself on the wrong end of town after delivering mending to Mrs. Peterson, the church had been her only refuge. She heard voices at the front entrance, men's voices, and panic seized her. Without thinking, she slipped behind the massive oak organ that stood like a sentinel at the back of the church. Its dark wooden frame and pipes created a perfect hiding place. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to quiet her breathing. "I'm telling you, Sheriff, that widow's hiding something. Nobody grieves that quiet. It ain't natural." The voice belonged to Walter Fleming, owner of the general store and chief purveyor of town gossip. "You got evidence, or just more speculation?" The second voice was unfamiliar deep, with a slight southern drawl. "Don't need evidence when everybody knows the truth. Jacob Zimmerman was healthy as a horse one day, dead the next, and that woman of his inherited everything." "Not much of a motive, considering Jacob left nothing but debts," the stranger countered. "You're new here, Taylor. You'll learn soon enough." The voices faded as the men moved toward the front of the church. Thea's heart hammered in her chest. She hadn't inherited anything but trouble and a tarnished reputation. Jacob had gambled away their savings before pneumonia took him, but the town preferred the more scandalous version of events. She waited several minutes after the voices disappeared, then carefully peered around the organ. The church appeared empty. She stepped out, smoothing her damp skirts when a floorboard creaked behind her. "Folks around here don't hide unless they've got reason to." Thea spun around, nearly losing her balance. Before her stood a tall man with broad shoulders, his dark hair slightly damp from the rain. His clothes weren't the rough garb of a miner or farmer, but they weren't city clothes either. A gun belt hung low on his hips, the mark of a man who knew how to use it. "I wasn't hiding," she lied, her voice barely a whisper. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, studied her face. There was something in his gaze that wasn't accusation or judgment, something she hadn't seen directed at her in months. Kindness. "Name's Thomas Xavier, new sheriff." He didn't offer his hand, seeming to sense her wariness. "And you must be Mrs. Zimmerman," she stiffened. "How did you small town? Your description's been mentioned a time or two." His mouth curved slightly. Though they failed to mention a few things, heat rose to her cheeks. "If you'll excuse me, Sheriff, the rain has stopped. I should be going." As she moved to pass him, he stepped aside but spoke softly. "You're safe with me, Mrs. Zimmerman." She paused, those simple words washing over her like a balm. How long had it been since anyone had offered her safety rather than suspicion? "Thank you, Sheriff," she managed, "but I've learned that safety is rarely guaranteed in this life." "Maybe so," he agreed, "but sometimes it's worth risking belief in it again." Thea hurried out of the church, the sheriff's words following her like the distant rumble of thunder across the plains. Safety was a luxury she could no longer afford to believe in, especially not from a man whose job was to uncover secrets. And Thea had secrets that needed to stay buried for her own protection. What she didn't realize as she hurried home through the mud-slicked streets was that Sheriff Thomas Xavier had secrets of his own, and their collision course had already begun. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed away the dust that perpetually hung over Redemption. Thea rose early as always, pinning her chestnut hair into a severe bun that aged her beyond her years. She had taken to dressing plainly, hoping to become invisible to the townsfolk's scrutiny. Today, she would need to visit the mercantile for thread, an errand she dreaded. Since Jacob's death, she had supported herself through seamstress work, her skilled hands creating and mending garments for those who would still employ her. Some refused her services entirely, like Mayor Hollister's wife, who had once been her friend. Others, like Walter Fleming, charged her double at his store, claiming it was risk insurance. She was halfway to Fleming's when she noticed Sheriff Xavier exiting the barbershop, freshly shaved. Something about his presence made her consider turning around, but he had already spotted her. "Mrs. Zimmerman," he called, crossing the dusty street toward her. "Fine morning." "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a slight nod, clutching her worn basket tighter. "I was hoping to have a word with you," he said, falling into step beside her, "regarding what matter?" "Your husband's affairs, actually." His voice was casual, but Thea felt ice slide down her spine. "There's nothing to discuss. Jacob died of pneumonia 6 months ago. Dr. Ransom can confirm it." Sheriff Xavier nodded. "I've read the doctor's report. I'm more interested in Jacob's business dealings before his death." They had reached Fleming's store. Through the window, Thea could see several women gathered inside, their attention already drawn to her and the sheriff. "I know very little about my husband's business," she said stiffly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd be happy to accompany you," he offered, reaching for the door. "That's not necessary." "I insist." Something in his tone made her look up at him. His expression remained pleasant, but his eyes held warning. "Some folks in town might be more courteous with me present," understanding dawned. He was offering protection from Fleming's usual treatment. Pride warred with practicality as she weighed her options. "Very well," she conceded. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Conversation halted abruptly. 4 women, including Mayor Hollister's wife Eugenia, stood by the fabric bolts. Walter Fleming himself was behind the counter, his perpetual scowl deepening at the sight of Thea. "Morning, ladies," Sheriff Xavier said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Fleming." "Sheriff," Fleming acknowledged, his eyes darting between them. "What can I do for you?" Just accompanying Mrs. Zimmerman on her errands, Thea approached the counter. "I need 3 spools of black thread, Mr. Fleming." Fleming reached beneath the counter and produced the thread, placing it before her with deliberate slowness. "That'll be 60 cents. 60 cents, Sheriff Xavier whistled low. "Seems steep for 3 spools of thread. Quality goods cost money, Sheriff. Is that right?" The sheriff leaned against the counter. "Funny, I was in Harrisburg last week. Thread was 15 cents a spool there. That would make this," he paused, calculating 45 cents by my reckoning. Fleming's face reddened. "We're not in Harrisburg." "No, we surely aren't." The sheriff's pleasant expression never wavered. "But I don't recall the territorial governor authorizing special taxation powers for mercantile owners." A tense silence fell. Thea could feel the women watching, feel their judgment and curiosity. 45 cents, Fleming finally muttered, pushing the thread toward Thea. She placed the coins on the counter, avoiding everyone's gaze. "Much obliged," Sheriff Xavier said cheerfully. "Come along, Mrs. Zimmerman. I believe you mentioned needing to visit the post office next." She hadn't mentioned any such thing, but gratefully followed him out. Once outside, she released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You shouldn't have done that," she said. "Now they'll talk even more." "They'll talk regardless," he replied. Might as well give them something worthwhile to discuss. Despite herself, Thea felt the corner of her mouth twitch. "Is antagonizing the local merchants part of your official duties, Sheriff? I consider fair treatment of all citizens very much my duty." He gestured toward the post office. "Shall we? I really do need to speak with you about your husband's affairs." The playfulness vanished from Thea's expression. "As I said, I know very little." "I think you know more than you're letting on," he said quietly, "and I think you have reasons for keeping it to yourself." She stopped walking, turning to face him. "Why are you concerning yourself with a closed matter? My husband died of natural causes." "I'm not investigating your husband's death, Mrs. Zimmerman. I'm investigating what he was involved in before he died." He lowered his voice. and who might still be looking to collect on certain debts. Fear flickered across her face before she could mask it. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. He glanced around the busy street. But this isn't the place to discuss it. Would you allow me to call on you this evening? Officially, every instinct told her to refuse, to keep this man and his questions at a distance, but something in his steady gaze made her hesitate. 7 o'clock, she finally said. I live in the small house behind the cooperative. I know where it is. Of course he did. Everyone in Redemption knew where the suspected widow lived. Until this evening, Mrs. Zimmerman. As he walked away, Thea couldn't shake the feeling that Sheriff Thomas Xavier had just maneuvered her like a chess piece. The question was, what game was he playing and whose side was he truly on? By late afternoon, Thea's hands ached from hours of delicate stitching. She had been working on a dress for the banker's daughter's upcoming wedding, one of the few wealthy families who still employed her skills, if discreetly. The work was demanding, but the payment would cover her rent for the month. As the clock neared 7, she found herself unusually concerned with her appearance. She changed from her work dress into her second-best gown, a navy blue that had once been considered fashionable. She loosened her severe buns slightly, allowing a few soft tendrils to frame her face. Don't be foolish, she scolded her reflection. This is an official visit, nothing more. Yet something about Sheriff Xavier unsettled her, and not entirely in an unpleasant way. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her without judgment or pity. A knock at precisely 7 o'clock startled her from her thoughts. She opened the door to find the sheriff standing on her small porch, hat in hand. He had changed into a clean shirt and vest, and the effect was rather striking. Mrs. Zimmerman, he said with a slight bow, thank you for agreeing to see me. Please come in, Sheriff. She stepped aside, suddenly conscious of her modest home. The front room served as both parlor and dining room, with a small kitchen beyond. Her bedroom was the only other room in the house. Would you care for some coffee? She offered, falling back on the manners her mother had instilled in her. That would be welcome, thank you. While she busied herself with the coffee pot, he remained standing, surveying the small room with interest. Unlike most frontier homes, hers contained several bookshelves filled with volumes. Jacob's collection, one of the few things of value he hadn't gambled away. You like to read, he observed. My husband did, she replied, setting 2 cups on the table. Please sit. He took a seat at the small dining table, placing his hat beside him. And you, do you share his taste in literature? She poured the coffee before answering. I prefer Austen to his Twain, but yes, I read. Is that relevant to your investigation, Sheriff? A smile touched his lips. Not directly, just trying to understand the woman behind the rumors. And what rumors might those be? She asked, sitting across from him. That depends on who's telling the tale. He sipped his coffee. Some say you poisoned your husband for his money, only to discover he had none. Others claim you drove him to his death with your cold ways. She flinched despite herself. People can be remarkably creative when spreading lies. Indeed, they can. He set down his cup. Which is why I prefer to form my own opinions based on facts. And what facts have you gathered about me, Sheriff Xavier? That you were born Theodora Grant in Boston. That you came west as a mail-order bride 3 years ago to marry Jacob Zimmerman, a man twice your age who presented himself as a successful businessman. That within a year of your marriage, his gambling debts became common knowledge, yet you stayed. His blue eyes held hers. And that despite the town's treatment of you since his death, you've remained in Redemption when most women would have fled. Thea's hands tightened around her cup. You've been thorough. It's my job. He leaned forward slightly. What I don't know is why Jacob was meeting with Clinton Ramsey the night before he fell ill. She couldn't hide her surprise. How did you? I have my sources. His expression grew serious. Clinton Ramsey isn't just a gambler, Mrs. Zimmerman. He's connected to some dangerous people who use his gambling halls to move money and information. If Jacob was involved with Ramsey beyond a simple card game, you could be in danger. Jacob lost money to many men, she said carefully. Mr. Ramsey was simply one of them. Was he also simply one of the men who came looking for payment after Jacob died? One of the men you told the previous sheriff about? Thea stood abruptly, moving to the window. Sheriff Ellis did nothing when I reported those visits. He suggested I pay whatever was owed or leave town. Ellis was incompetent and corrupt, Xavier said flatly. I'm neither. She turned to face him. What exactly do you want from me, Sheriff? Information, he replied, and in exchange I'm offering protection. Protection, she repeated, the word tasting foreign on her tongue. The last man who promised me protection left me with nothing but debts and a tarnished name. I'm not offering marriage, Mrs. Zimmerman. His voice held a trace of amusement. Just the full authority of my office. Heat rose to her cheeks. I didn't mean to imply, no offense taken. He stood, approaching her with deliberate slowness as one might approach a skittish horse. Mrs. Zimmerman, Thea, I believe your husband was involved in something more dangerous than gambling, something that got him killed. She stared at him, her heart pounding. The doctors said it was pneumonia. Doctors can be paid to say many things. Are you suggesting Jacob was murdered? I'm suggesting that pneumonia was convenient for certain people. He was standing close now, close enough that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. People who might still consider you a loose end. The room seemed suddenly airless. Why would anyone think that? I knew nothing of Jacob's dealings. But they don't know that. His voice softened. Have there been others besides Ramsey, men asking about papers or messages? The question hit too close to home. Just last month, a stranger had approached her after church, asking if Jacob had left anything for safekeeping. She had fled, terrified. Sheriff Xavier must have read the answer in her face. You're not safe here alone, Thea. Nowhere is safe for a woman alone, she countered. At least here I can earn my living. There are other towns, other places where your skill with a needle would be valued. Are you suggesting I run? I'm suggesting you consider your options while I investigate further. His gaze held hers. Will you trust me enough to tell me everything you know about Jacob's final weeks? Every visitor, every strange occurrence. Trust, such a simple word for such a monumental request. Thea had once trusted Jacob when he wrote promising a good life, trusted that his business ventures would succeed, trusted that the people of redemption would be fair. Each trust had been broken, and yet. There was something in Thomas Xavier's steady gaze that made her want to believe again. It will take some time to recall everything, she said finally. Relief flickered across his face. I have time, she gestured to the table. Then we should sit. It's a longer story than you might expect. As the night deepened around Thea's small house, she found herself revealing things she had told no one about Jacob's increasingly erratic behavior in his final weeks, the late-night visitors, the mysterious package he had hidden and refused to discuss. Sheriff Xavier listened intently, occasionally asking questions but never interrupting her flow of recollection. The night before he fell ill, she concluded, Jacob came home late, soaking wet from the rain. He was agitated more than I'd ever seen him. He kept saying he'd fixed it and that we'd be leaving redemption as soon as he collected what he was owed. Did he say who owed him? No, but he mentioned Denver. She twisted her wedding ring, a simple gold band that was now too loose. The next morning he couldn't get out of bed. By evening he was delirious with fever. 3 days later he was gone. Thomas somehow, during the hours of conversation, he had become Thomas rather than Sheriff Xavier, and her mind sat back, considering. And the package he hid, I never found it, she admitted. I searched the house after he died, but there was nothing unusual, just debts. What about his personal effects? Anything unexpected? She thought for a moment. There was a book one I didn't recognize. I assumed he had borrowed it. What book? A collection of Shakespeare's sonnets. Jacob never read poetry. Thomas sat forward. Do you still have it? Yes, it's on the shelf. Jacob had marked several pages. She rose and went to the bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines until she found the volume in question. She handed it to Thomas, who opened it carefully. These dog-eared pages, he murmured, they could be significant. How could Shakespeare be significant to gambling debts? Not the poetry itself, he explained, but what might be hidden within it, codes, messages. He looked up at her. May I borrow this? She nodded, suddenly feeling exhausted. The weight of secrets shared had drained her. Thomas must have noticed. He closed the book and stood. It's late. I've kept you long enough. Will this help? She asked, gesturing to the book. Will solving this mystery make the town stop judging me? His expression softened. People judge what they don't understand, Thea, but yes, if we can prove Jacob was involved in something beyond his control, it might change some minds. And if he wasn't, if he simply made bad choices until they caught up with him, then we'll deal with that truth too. He reached for his hat. Thank you for your trust tonight. She walked him to the door, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. With him would go the first genuine conversation she'd had in months. I'll come by tomorrow, he said, stepping onto the porch. In the meantime, keep your doors locked. They always are, she assured him. He paused, studying her face in the lamplight. You're stronger than this town gives you credit for, Thea Zimmerman. Before she could respond, he was gone, his tall figure disappearing into the darkness. Thea closed the door, sliding the bolt into place. For the first time in months, she felt something other than fear and resignation. She felt hope. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Thea's door. Eugenia Hollister, the mayor's wife, stood on her porch looking distinctly uncomfortable. Mrs. Hollister, Thea said, unable to hide her surprise. What brings you here? May I come in? Eugenia glanced nervously over her shoulder. Puzzled, Thea stepped aside. Once they were inside with the door closed, Eugenia's prim demeanor cracked. I saw the sheriff leaving your house last night, she said without preamble. After dark, people are talking. I'm well aware that people talk about me regardless of what I do, Thea replied evenly. Sheriff Xavier was here on official business, until nearly midnight. Eugenia raised an eyebrow. Thea, I know we haven't spoken much since Jacob's passing, but I'm here as a friend. Thea nearly laughed at that. Eugenia had been one of the first to shun her after Jacob died, canceling their weekly tea gatherings without explanation. What exactly are you suggesting, Eugenia? I'm suggesting that a widow in your position cannot afford further scandal. Eugenia lowered her voice. There are already rumors about you and the new sheriff. Rumors he's been in town less than a week, which makes your closeness all the more noteworthy, Eugenia sighed. I'm trying to help you, Thea. Whatever the sheriff is investigating, surely it can be discussed during daylight hours in a public place. Thea felt a flicker of anger. Thank you for your concern, but I believe I can manage my own reputation. Can you? Eugenia's gaze swept the small house. You need this town's goodwill to survive, Thea. Your seamstress work depends on it. The implied threat wasn't subtle. As the mayor's wife, Eugenia influenced which women employed Thea's services. The sheriff is investigating matters related to Jacob, Thea said carefully. Once resolved, I'm sure his visits will cease. Eugenia seemed to accept this. Well, that's something, at least. She adjusted her gloves. The sewing circle meets tomorrow at my house. Perhaps you should join us. It would be a step toward reconciliation with certain elements in town. Thea recognized the olive branch for what it was: conditional acceptance predicated on conformity. Still, she needed the work that might come from such connections. Thank you for the invitation, she said. What time shall I arrive? 2:00. Eugenia moved toward the door. And Thea, perhaps wear something other than black. It's been 6 months after all. After Eugenia left, Thea stood in her doorway, conflicted. The invitation was both opportunity and manipulation. Yet before she could consider it further, she spotted Thomas approaching from the direction of the sheriff's office. He carried a parcel under one arm. Good morning, he called, removing his hat as he reached her. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, she replied, stepping back to let him enter. Though I should warn you that my neighbor across the street is watching with great interest. Thomas glanced in that direction and offered a friendly wave to the woman who quickly ducked behind her curtain. Mrs. Porter. She brought cookies to my office yesterday, along with a comprehensive list of eligible ladies in town. Despite herself, Thea smiled. Redemption's matchmakers work quickly, so I've noticed. He set his parcel on the table. I've brought something I think you should see. Curious, Thea joined him as he unwrapped the brown paper, revealing a stack of documents. Land deeds, he explained. All registered to Jacob Zimmerman. She stared at the papers in confusion. That's not possible. Jacob owned nothing but this house, and even that had a lien against it that I've been paying monthly. According to these, he purchased 3 parcels outside of town about a month before he died. Thomas spread the documents before her, using cash. Where would Jacob get that kind of money? She picked up one of the deeds, examining it. And why wouldn't he tell me? That's what we need to find out. Thomas pulled out another paper, a roughly drawn map. The parcels form a triangle around Ramsey Creek, just north of where the Denver and Rio Grande plans to lay track next spring. Understanding dawned. The railroad. Jacob was speculating on railroad land. Smart investment if you have inside information, Thomas agreed. The railroad hasn't announced that route yet. But where did he get the money? Thea repeated. We were barely keeping this house. I have a theory. Thomas reached for the Shakespeare volume he'd borrowed. There were messages hidden in this book, references to delivery dates and locations. I believe Jacob was working as a courier between Ramsey and someone in Denver, possibly within the railroad company itself. Thea sank into a chair. A courier for what? Information. The kind that could make a man rich if he knew where to invest before official announcements. So Jacob stole information he was supposed to deliver and used it himself. The very idea made her feel ill. It was one thing to know her husband had been a gambler. It was another to learn he had been a thief. That would explain why Ramsey's men came looking for him, or rather, for whatever he was supposed to deliver. Thomas sat beside her. Did Jacob ever mention a man named Whitaker? She shook her head. No, never. He's Ramsey's partner in Denver, and according to my sources, he's not the forgiving type. Fear clutched at Thea's heart. You think these men killed Jacob? I think pneumonia was convenient, Thomas said carefully, but without proof it remains speculation. And now they're looking for whatever Jacob took, she whispered. Yes, but there's something else. Thomas leaned forward. These land deeds are valuable now with the railroad coming, very valuable. Then why hasn't Ramsey claimed them? Surely he knows about them. The deeds are in Jacob's name and now, by inheritance, in yours. Ramsey can't touch them without exposing his own illegal activities. Thomas's blue eyes held hers. You're sitting on a fortune, Thea, and that makes you very dangerous to certain people. The reality of her situation crashed over her. What am I supposed to do? I can't sell land I didn't know I had without raising questions. No, he agreed, but I have an idea that might draw out our quarry. He hesitated. It would require your cooperation and would put you at some risk. More risk than I'm already in, she asked dryly. Calculated risk, under my protection. There it was again, that offer of protection. This time, however, Thea found herself considering it seriously. What would I need to do? Let it be known that you're planning to sell Jacob's properties. That you've found a buyer from Denver. He watched her reaction. It would force whoever is watching you to make a move. Use me as bait, you mean? Despite her apprehension, Thea found the idea oddly appealing. After months of powerlessness, taking action, even dangerous action, felt right. I wouldn't let any harm come to you, Thomas promised. You have my word. She studied him, this man who had walked into her life just days ago and appended everything she thought she knew. Why are you doing this, Sheriff? This goes beyond your official duties. Something flickered in his eyes, something personal. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see Ramsey and his associates brought to justice. Before she could press further, a knock at the door startled them both. Thomas immediately moved his hand to his gun. Are you expecting anyone? No, she whispered. He gestured for her to stay seated while he approached the door. Who is it? He called. Telegram for Mrs. Zimmerman, came the reply. Thomas relaxed slightly but still opened the door with caution. Young Billy from the telegraph office stood on the porch, message in hand. Morning, Sheriff, the boy said, clearly surprised to find him there. Got a telegram for Mrs. Zimmerman. Thomas tipped the boy and closed the door, bringing the telegram to Thea. She opened it with trembling fingers. Property matters require immediate attention. Stop arriving. Redemption. Friday. Stop Whitaker. She handed the paper to Thomas, whose expression darkened as he read it. It seems our plan is already in motion, he said grimly. Whitaker is coming here. How could he know about the deeds already? He might not. He could be coming about whatever Jacob was supposed to deliver. Thomas folded the telegram. Either way, we have 3 days to prepare. Thea felt strangely calm. After months of uncertainty and fear, at least now there was a clear danger and a plan to face it. What do we do? First, you accept Eugenia Hollister's invitation to her sewing circle. At her surprised look, he smiled. Thin walls, I heard her invitation. You need to appear completely normal while we set our trap. And what trap are we setting, exactly? Thomas's smile turned grim. We're going to give Mr. Whitaker exactly what he's looking for, and then we're going to arrest him for Jacob's murder. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Thea attended Eugenia's sewing circle wearing a lavender dress instead of black, her concession to the suggestion that she move beyond mourning. The ladies received her with polite surprise, and as Thomas had predicted, the gathering proved useful. By the end of the afternoon, she had casually mentioned her intention to sell some property Jacob had left her. Property? Eugenia had asked, unable to hide her surprise. I wasn't aware Jacob owned anything of value, nor was I until recently, Thea replied, focusing on her needlework. It seems he made some investments before his death, quite fortunate, really. By evening, the news had spread throughout Redemption. Thomas reported that Walter Fleming had asked him about it directly. Fleming's connected to Ramsey, he explained as they sat in her kitchen that night. He's been watching you since I arrived in town. They had fallen into a pattern. Thomas would come after dark, using the back entrance to avoid being seen. They would plan until late, his presence both reassuring and increasingly distracting to Thea. She found herself noticing things: the way his hands moved when he spoke, the lines that appeared at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the unexpected gentleness in his voice when he spoke her name. What happens when Whitaker arrives? She asked, pushing away such thoughts. He'll approach you, probably somewhere public enough to avoid suspicion but private enough for conversation. Thomas spread a map of the town between them. I'll have Deputy Wilson watching the stagecoach arrival. Once Whitaker's identified, we follow his movements. And if he simply demands whatever Jacob took, you tell him you have it hidden and can retrieve it that evening. Suggest meeting at your house after dark. Thomas traced a path on the map. I'll be waiting inside. Wilson and I will take him when he makes the explicit threat or offer. What if he's not alone? Thomas's expression grew serious. That's a possibility we've prepared for. Wilson has deputized 2 men he trusts. Thea nodded, trying to appear more confident than she felt. And afterwards, when this is over, you'll be free, he said simply. Free of suspicion, free of threat. The deeds will be legally yours to sell or keep as you choose. Freedom. The word tasted strange after so many months of confinement, not physical imprisonment, but the prison of suspicion and fear that had become her life in Redemption. Would you leave? Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Once this is resolved, the question caught her off guard. I haven't thought that far ahead. You should. His blue eyes held hers. Think about what you want, not just what you're running from, what she wanted. It had been so long since Thea had allowed herself to want anything beyond survival that the concept felt foreign. What did she want? A home without whispers following her, work that utilized her skills, perhaps even companionship. She looked away, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how intimate the kitchen felt with just the 2 of them and a single lamp burning. It's getting late, she said. You should go before Mrs. Porter reports another midnight visitor to the mayor's wife. Thomas smiled, but there was something wistful in it. Of course, he rose, gathering his hat. Get some rest. Tomorrow's the day. As he left through the back door, Thea realized she had never asked him the most important question. What would he do when this was over? Would he stay in Redemption, or was he simply passing through, righting wrongs before moving on to the next town that needed him? And why did the answer matter so much to her? Friday dawned clear and crisp, the mountains to the west gleaming in the early sunlight. Thea had barely slept, her mind racing with all the possibilities and dangers the day might bring. She dressed with care in a green dress that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, then pinned her hair in a softer style than her usual severe bun. If she was to be bait, she might as well be effective bait. The stagecoach was due at noon. Thomas had instructed her to go about her normal routine, which on Fridays meant delivering finished mending to several houses around town. She gathered her basket and set out, hyper-aware of every glance, every whispered comment as she passed. News of her property had spread quickly. She could feel the speculation following her like a shadow. By 11:30, she had completed her deliveries and, as planned, headed to the small cafe across from the stagecoach office. Thomas would be watching from the sheriff's office, while Deputy Wilson would position himself near the arriving coach. The cafe was busier than usual, the Friday stage bringing not just passengers but mail and packages that townspeople were eager to collect. Thea took a seat by the window, ordering coffee and a slice of pie she had no appetite for. At precisely noon, the stagecoach rolled into town in a cloud of dust. Thea watched as passengers disembarked, a family with 2 children, an elderly gentleman, and finally, a well-dressed man of about 50 with silver at his temples and a bearing that spoke of wealth and confidence. Deputy Wilson casually approached him, offering to carry his bag to the hotel. The man, Whitaker, she presumed declined with a wave of his hand and proceeded directly to the hotel himself. Thea released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The first part of their plan had worked. Whitaker had arrived and been identified. Now they would wait for him to make contact. She didn't have to wait long. She had just paid for her untouched pie when the cafe door opened and Whitaker himself entered. He surveyed the room before his gaze settled on her. Without hesitation, he approached her table. "Mrs. Zimmerman?" His voice was smooth, cultured, the voice of a businessman accustomed to getting his way. "Yes," she replied, feigning surprise. "Harold Whitaker." He extended his hand. "I was acquainted with your late husband. May I join you?" She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Of course." Whitaker sat, removing his gloves with deliberate precision. "I was sorry to hear of Jacob's passing. Pneumonia, I understand. Such a tragedy." "Thank you," she murmured. "Did you know my husband well? We had business dealings." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "In fact, that's why I've come to redemption. Jacob was holding something for me before his untimely death." Thea's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral. "Something valuable, I presume?" "Very." Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "I believe you know what I'm referring to, Mrs. Zimmerman." "I'm afraid I don't," she said, watching his face carefully. Jacob kept his business affairs private. A flicker of annoyance crossed Whitaker's features. "Come now. A woman like you, intelligent, observant, surely you were aware of your husband's activities." "My husband gambled and lost money with alarming regularity," she replied honestly. "Beyond that, his business affairs were a mystery to me." Whitaker studied her, clearly trying to determine if she was being truthful. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. I'm staying at the hotel. I'm afraid I have appointments this afternoon," she interrupted. "But if it's important, you could call at my house this evening. Say 8 o'clock." Something calculating entered his gaze. "That would be acceptable." "Excellent." She stood, gathering her basket. "Until this evening, Mr. Whitaker." As she left the cafe, she could feel his eyes following her. The encounter had gone exactly as Thomas had predicted, yet she couldn't shake a sense of unease. There had been something in Whitaker's manner, a confidence that suggested he held cards they didn't know about. She needed to find Thomas. The sheriff's office was empty when she arrived, but a note on the desk indicated he had gone to check the outlying roads for any of Whitaker's associates who might have arrived separately. Deputy Wilson was still watching the hotel. Thea left a brief message about her encounter and then headed home to prepare for the evening's confrontation. As she walked, she felt as though eyes were watching her from every window, every alleyway. Whether it was the usual town scrutiny or something more sinister, she couldn't tell. By 7 o'clock, Thomas still hadn't come to her house. Worry gnawed at her. This deviation from their plan left her feeling vulnerable and uncertain. She paced her small front room, jumping at every sound from outside. At 7:30, there was a knock at her back door. Relief flooded her as she hurried to open it. "Thomas, where have you?" She stopped short. It wasn't Thomas, but Deputy Wilson, his young face grave. Mrs. Zimmerman, he said in a low voice. May I come in? She stepped aside, dread pooling in her stomach. What's happened? Where's Sheriff Xavier? Wilson removed his hat, twisting it in his hands. There was an incident on the North Road. Sheriff was ambushed by two men we believe are connected to Whitaker. Fear clutched at her heart. Is he? He's alive, Wilson assured her quickly. Took a bullet to the shoulder. Doc Ransom is with him now. Thea sagged against the wall, relief and renewed fear warring within her. Whitaker is coming here at 8. We had a plan. I know the plan, Wilson said. Sheriff told me everything before they brought him to the doctors. I'm here to take his place. She studied the young deputy. He couldn't be more than 22, his face still boyish despite his attempt at a serious expression. She had seen him around town but knew little about him except that Thomas trusted him. Have you ever done anything like this before? She asked. No, madam, he admitted. But I know what to do. Sheriff was real clear on the instructions. 8 o'clock was approaching rapidly. They had no choice but to proceed. Where will you hide? She asked, moving into the front room. Sheriff said behind the bedroom door would give the best vantage point. Wilson shifted uncomfortably. Begging your pardon, madam. It's fine, she assured him. You can see the entire front room from there. They had barely finished positioning Wilson when there was a knock at the front door. Thea smoothed her skirts, took a deep breath, and went to answer it. Harold Whitaker stood on her porch, impeccably dressed in evening attire, as though calling on a social acquaintance rather than attempting extortion. Mrs. Zimmerman, he said with a slight bow. Thank you for receiving me at this late hour. Mr. Whitaker, she acknowledged, stepping aside. Please come in, he entered, surveying the modest house with barely concealed disdain. Charming, though I imagine it's quite a change from what Jacob had promised you. My husband made many promises, she replied, gesturing to a chair. Would you care to sit? I prefer to stand for now. His smile was cold. Let's dispense with the pretense, shall we? Jacob took something that belongs to me. I want it back. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Thea said, maintaining the script she and Thomas had prepared. Information, Mrs. Zimmerman. Specifically, railroad routing information that Jacob was paid to deliver to me. Whitaker's voice hardened. Information he instead used to purchase land that will be worth 10 times its value when the Denver and Rio Grande makes its official announcement. I know nothing about any railroad information, she said truthfully. Perhaps not initially, he conceded. But you've recently been making inquiries about selling property you shouldn't have known existed unless you found what Jacob took. Thea realized their plan had backfired. By spreading word of the land, they had confirmed to Whitaker that she had whatever Jacob had stolen. The deeds were among Jacob's papers, she improvised. I only discovered them recently. And the information that accompanied them, the schedules, the surveys, the bribery records. Whitaker stepped closer. Where are they, Mrs. Zimmerman? This was the moment Wilson should emerge, the explicit threat having been made, but the bedroom door remained closed. I don't know what you're talking about, she insisted, moving away from him. Whitaker reached into his coat and withdrew a small pistol. I think you do. And I think you're going to show me exactly where Jacob hid everything, or this charming little house is going to become the site of another tragic Zimmerman death. Terror shot through her. Where was Wilson? Why wasn't he intervening? The papers aren't here, she said quickly. Jacob hid them elsewhere. Then you'll take me to them. Whitaker gestured with the gun. Now. The bedroom door finally opened, but instead of Wilson charging out with his weapon drawn, the young deputy stumbled forward, blood staining his shirt. Behind him stood a second man, one of Ramsey's thugs she recognized from his previous visits after Jacob's death. Found this one hiding in the bedroom, the thug announced. Amateur. Whitaker seemed unsurprised. Is he dead? Not yet. Knocked him out first, then added a little insurance. The man held up a bloody knife. Pity, I prefer clean operations. Whitaker turned back to Thea, whose mind was racing with horror and desperation. As you can see, Mrs. Zimmerman, your protector has failed you. Now about those papers. I told you they're not here, she repeated, trying to keep her voice steady. Where then? She needed time for Thomas to realize something had gone wrong, time for help to arrive. The church, she improvised. Jacob hid them in the church, behind the organ. A flicker of something recognition perhaps crossed Whitaker's face. An appropriate hiding place for a man who rarely attended services. He gestured with the gun. After you, Mrs. Zimmerman, and no heroics. My associate here has very little patience. As they forced her from the house, Thea's mind whirled with fear and desperate plans. The church was dark at this hour, locked for the night, but she knew where Pastor Mills kept the spare key. If she could just get inside, perhaps she could find a way to escape or signal for help. The streets of Redemption were quiet as they walked, Whitaker on one side of her, his thug on the other. The gun remained hidden but present beneath Whitaker's coat. Anyone seeing them might assume they were simply escorting a lady home after an evening visit. The church loomed ahead, its white steeple silvered by moonlight. Thea led them to the side door, reaching above the frame for the hidden key. Clever, Whitaker murmured. One wonders what other secrets you're privy to. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open with a creak that seemed thunderous in the night stillness. Inside, the church was shadowy, with only moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows. Where? Whitaker demanded. The organ, she replied, moving down the center aisle. There's a compartment behind it. The massive organ stood at the back of the church, its pipes reaching toward the ceiling like silent sentinels. Thea moved behind it, into the narrow space between the instrument and the wall. Here, shadows gathered thickly. I don't see any compartment, Whitaker said, his patience clearly thinning. It's here, she insisted, feeling along the wooden back of the organ. Jacob showed me once. It was a lie, of course. There was no compartment, no hidden papers. But in the darkness behind the organ, she had spotted something, a door that led to the small room where choir robes were stored, if she could just reach it. Mrs. Zimmerman, Whitaker's voice had turned dangerously soft. I'm beginning to think you're stalling. No, it's here, I swear, she said, edging closer to the door. Just a bit further back, a noise from the front of the church interrupted her, the sound of the main doors opening. Whitaker gestured for his man to investigate while keeping the gun trained on Thea. If that's another deputy, he whispered, you'll watch him die before you join him. Thea's heart hammered in her chest. Who would be coming to the church at this hour? Had Thomas somehow learned of their situation? Footsteps echoed in the nave, a steady, measured tread that spoke of confidence rather than caution. Then a voice called out, a voice she recognized instantly. I know you're here, Whitaker. Let Mrs. Zimmerman go and we can discuss this like businessmen. Thomas. Despite his injury, he had come. Relief and fresh fear battled within her. Sheriff Xavier, Whitaker called back. I was wondering when you'd join us. Your deputy proved disappointingly easy to neutralize. Wilson's alive, Thomas replied, his voice closer now. Your man's in custody. It's over, Whitaker. I think not. Whitaker's grip on Thea's arm tightened. I still have what you might call a compelling negotiating position. They emerged from behind the organ to find Thomas standing in the center aisle, his left arm in a makeshift sling, his right hand resting on his gun. You look a bit worse for wear, Sheriff, Whitaker observed. That ambush was meant to be fatal. My associates must be losing their touch, or I'm harder to kill than you anticipated. Thomas's gaze locked with Thea's, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a slight nod, indicating she was unharmed. Here's what's going to happen, Whitaker said. Mrs. Zimmerman is going to tell me where Jacob hid my property, then she's going to sign over those land deeds to me. After that, I might consider letting you both live. That's not going to happen, Thomas replied calmly. What is going to happen is you're going to drop that gun and face charges for the murder of Jacob Zimmerman. Whitaker laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Murder? Jacob died of pneumonia. Everyone in town knows that. Pneumonia caused by poison, Thomas countered. A poison that mimics the symptoms but is virtually undetectable unless someone knows to look for it. Someone like the territorial medical examiner who is currently re-examining samples of Jacob's tissue. Thea stared at Thomas in shock. He had never mentioned this part of his investigation. That's a bluff, Whitaker said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Is it? Thomas took a step forward. Jacob stole from you, that's true. But you couldn't afford a public confrontation, not with the railroad deal hanging in the balance, so you had him poisoned. Subtle, deniable, but not unprovable. Another step forward. Thea could see that Thomas was pale beneath his tan, his injury clearly taking a toll. "Stay where you are, Sheriff," Whitaker warned, raising his gun more visibly. "You won't shoot me in a church, Whitaker." Thomas took another step. "Too many questions, too much attention, that's not your style." "Perhaps not," Whitaker conceded, "but accidents happen, even in holy places." Grief-stricken widows sometimes take their own lives. Wounded lawmen occasionally succumb to their injuries. The threat hung in the air between them. Thea felt Whitaker's grip on her arm loosen slightly as he focused more on Thomas. It was the opening she had been waiting for. With a sudden twist, she broke free, dropping to the floor and rolling away just as Thomas drew his gun with lightning speed. Two shots rang out simultaneously, the sound deafening in the church's acoustic space. Whitaker stumbled backward, a look of surprise on his face as red bloomed across his pristine white shirt. Thomas remained standing, though he swayed slightly. "Thomas," Thea scrambled to her feet and rushed to his side. "I'm all right," he assured her, though his voice was strained. "Check Whitaker." She approached the fallen man cautiously. Whitaker's eyes were open but unfocused, his breathing shallow. The bullet had struck him in the chest. "He needs a doctor," she said. "So does Wilson," Thomas replied, holstering his gun with difficulty. "Go to my office. Send whoever's there to get Doc Ransom and bring him here." "I'm not leaving you," she protested. "Thea," he said gently, "I'm not going anywhere, but if Whitaker dies without confessing, we may never clear your name completely." Reluctantly, she agreed, hurrying from the church and toward the sheriff's office. The commotion had already drawn attention. Lights were appearing in windows along the street, and she could hear voices calling questions. At the office, she found two men Thomas had deputized standing guard over Ramsey's captured thug. She quickly explained the situation, and one ran to fetch the doctor while the other accompanied her back to the church. By the time they returned, a small crowd had gathered outside. Inside, they found Thomas sitting in a pew, his gun trained on Whitaker, who lay on the floor moaning softly. "Help's coming," she told Thomas, kneeling beside him. In the better light, she could see that his wound had reopened, blood seeping through his bandaged shoulder. "Good," he murmured, his face ashen. Whitaker talked, admitted to ordering Jacob's poisoning. "Johnson here heard it all." He nodded toward the deputy. "Yes, madam," Johnson confirmed. "Clear as day, said he had your husband poisoned because he stole railroad plans." Relief washed over Thea, relief that quickly turned to concern as Thomas slumped against her. "Thomas," she whispered urgently. "Just tired," he assured her, though his eyes were struggling to stay focused. "Been a long day." Dr. Ransom arrived moments later, taking charge of the scene with brisk efficiency. Whitaker was still alive and transported to the doctor's surgery, under guard. Thomas, despite his protests, was ordered back to his room above the sheriff's office for rest and treatment. "You'll stay with him," Ransom told Thea. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact. "He's lost blood and needs watching through the night." And so, as dawn broke over redemption the next morning, Thea found herself sitting beside Thomas's bed, exhaustion and relief mingling as she watched the steady rise and fall of his chest. He had fallen into a deep sleep after Ransom had tended his wound, the doctor assuring her that, with proper care, he would recover fully. The events of the night had spread through town like wildfire. Deputy Wilson, though seriously injured, would survive. Whitaker had been stabilized but remained under guard. And most importantly for Thea, the truth about Jacob's death had been revealed. She must have dozed off in the chair because she woke to find Thomas watching her, his blue eyes clear and alert. "Good morning," he said softly. "How are you feeling?" she asked, leaning forward to check his bandage. "Like I've been shot," he replied with a wry smile. "Twice in 1 month, I'm developing bad habits." "Twice," she frowned. "You never mentioned being shot before." Something flickered in his eyes. "There's a lot I haven't mentioned, Thea." She settled back in her chair, suddenly aware that there were still mysteries between them. Such as, he was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words. Such is the real reason I came to Redemption. It wasn't just a job opening. I suspected as much, she admitted. You knew too much about Jacob, about Whitaker and Ramsey. Yes, he shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. I've been tracking Whitaker for over a year. He and his associates have been running this railroad information scheme across 3 territories. Land fraud, bribery, murder when necessary. You're not just a sheriff, she guessed. I'm a Pinkerton agent, he confirmed, sent to investigate after several suspicious deaths connected to the railroad. Jacob's was one of them. The revelation should have shocked her, yet somehow it made perfect sense. His competence, his knowledge, his determination all spoke of something beyond a frontier lawman. Why tell me now? She asked. Because it's over, he said simply. Whitaker will stand trial. Ramsey too, once we bring him in from Denver. The evidence you helped uncover will put them away for good. And you, she couldn't quite keep the apprehension from her voice. Will you be moving on to your next assignment? Thomas was silent for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. That depends, he finally said. On what? On whether there's a reason for me to stay. The words hung between them, filled with unspoken meaning. Thea felt her heart quicken. The town needs a sheriff, she offered, not quite ready to voice what they both seemed to be circling. Is that the only reason you can think of? His voice was gentle, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. No, she admitted softly. It's not the only reason. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. When I found you hiding behind that church organ, something happened, Thea, something I wasn't expecting. What was that? She asked, though she thought she knew the answer. I recognized something in you, a strength, a resilience I've seen in few people. His thumb traced circles on her palm. The more I learned about you, the more I admired that strength, and somewhere along the way, admiration became something more. Thea felt tears prick at her eyes. After months of isolation and suspicion, his words were like rain on parched earth. I've been alone for so long, she whispered. Afraid to trust, afraid to hope. I know, he squeezed her hand. But you're not alone anymore, Thea, not unless you want to be. She looked at their joined hands, then back to his face. What happens now? Now, a smile touched his lips. Now you help me recover from this blasted shoulder wound. Then, perhaps, we see what life in Redemption might look like without secrets and shadows between us. I'd like that, she said, returning his smile, though the town might talk. Let them, he replied with a shrug that he immediately regretted, judging by his wince. They'll have plenty to discuss once Whitaker's testimony becomes public. A knock at the door interrupted them. Deputy Johnson entered, looking apologetic. Begging your pardon, Sheriff Mrs. Zimmerman, but there's quite a crowd gathered downstairs wanting information. Mayor Hollister among them, Thomas sighed. Tell them I'll make a full statement this afternoon. Yes, sir, Johnson hesitated. There's something else. Mrs. Hollister is asking specifically to see Mrs. Zimmerman, says it's important. Thea and Thomas exchanged a glance. Tell her I'll be down shortly, Thea decided after Johnson left. Thomas's expression grew concerned. You don't have to face them alone. Yes, I do, she said with newfound confidence. It's time I stopped hiding, he nodded, understanding in his eyes. I'll be here when you return. The promise in those simple words warmed her. She squeezed his hand once more before standing. Rest, she instructed. Sheriff's orders. His laugh followed her out the door. Downstairs, she found Eugenia Hollister pacing the sheriff's office, her usual prim demeanor nowhere in evidence. Thea, Eugenia rushed forward as she entered. Are you hurt? We heard the most dreadful accounts: gunfire at the church, the sheriff wounded, that Denver businessman shot. I'm unharmed, Thea assured her, surprised by the genuine concern in Eugenia's voice. Thank heavens. Eugenia clasped her hands. The mayor is organizing an emergency town meeting. We need to know what happened. Mr. Whitaker confessed to having my husband murdered, Thea said simply. The sheriff will provide all the details later today. Eugenia's eyes widened. Then the rumors about Jacob's death were false, Thea finished firmly, as the sheriff will confirm. A look of shame crossed Eugenia's face. Thea, that is, many of us owe you an apology. We assumed the worst without cause. The apology, however belated, was unexpected. Thea considered how to respond. Part of her wanted to reject it, to hold on to the righteous anger she had carried for months. But she recognized that path led nowhere she wanted to go. "Thank you, Eugenia," she said finally. "I appreciate that." Relief flooded the other woman's features. "The sewing circle meets again next Tuesday. Your place will be waiting for you." It was a peace offering, a gesture of reacceptance. A week ago, it would have meant everything to Thea. Now she found it mattered less than she had expected. "I'll consider it," she said noncommittally. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I promised the sheriff I'd help with his wound." Eugenia's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, we'll speak later." As Eugenia left, Thea felt a strange lightness. The town's approval or disapproval no longer seemed to carry the weight it once had. Something had shifted within her during the night's dangers, a realization that she was stronger than she had believed, more capable than anyone had given her credit for. And there was something else, something warm and hopeful that had taken root in her heart. Something that had begun the moment a wounded sheriff had found her hiding behind a church organ and whispered that she was safe with him. She climbed the stairs back to Thomas's room, her step lighter than it had been in months. Whatever the future held, she would face it standing tall, not hiding in shadows. And perhaps, if fate was kind, she would not face it alone. Over the next 2 weeks, Redemption witnessed remarkable changes. Harold Whitaker, recovering from his wound under guard, provided testimony that implicated not only himself and Clinton Ramsey in Jacob's murder, but also revealed a network of corruption that extended to several territorial officials. Telegrams flew between Redemption and Denver as the investigation expanded. Thomas, despite Dr. Ransom's orders to rest, worked tirelessly from his sick bed, coordinating with Pinkerton contacts and territorial authorities. Thea remained by his side, helping with correspondence and bringing meals, her presence a constant that neither of them seemed willing to forego. The town's attitude toward Thea underwent its own transformation. The whispers that had once followed her became expressions of sympathy and admiration. Walter Fleming personally delivered a basket of goods to her house with a mumbled apology about misunderstandings. Mayor Hollister made a public statement praising her courage and resilience. Thea accepted it all with grace, but maintained a certain distance. The easy trust she had once placed in her neighbors had been irreparably damaged. Only with Thomas did she allow her guards to lower completely. Their relationship evolved with a natural ease that surprised them both. What had begun as an alliance of necessity had blossomed into something deeper, a connection forged in danger, but nurtured in quieter moments of shared confidences and gentle touches. By the time Thomas was well enough to return to his duties, the question of his staying in Redemption had been answered without words. He sent a letter to his Pinkerton supervisor requesting permanent assignment as the town's sheriff, citing the ongoing investigation and the need for stability in a community shaken by revelation. The land deeds that had caused such trouble remained in Thea's possession. With Thomas's guidance, she sold 2 of the parcels to the railroad for a sum that ensured her financial independence. The third, a beautiful stretch of land overlooking Ramsey Creek, soon to be renamed, the town council decided, she kept. "It's good land," Thomas observed one evening as they rode out to survey it. His arm was still in a sling, but he managed his horse with practiced ease. "Could be a fine homestead with the right improvements." Thea gazed across the rolling grassland to the distant mountains. "It's peaceful here." Away from prying eyes. "Thinking of building?" he asked casually, though something in his tone suggested the question carried more weight than its simple words. "Perhaps." She turned to look at him, the setting sun gilding his features, though it seems a large undertaking for one person. Thomas dismounted carefully, then helped her down from her horse. He kept his hands at her waist longer than necessary, his blue eyes serious in the fading light. "What if it wasn't just one person?" he asked softly, her heart quickened. "What are you suggesting, Sheriff Xavier?" "I'm suggesting," he said, drawing her closer, "that I've fallen in love with the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known, and I'm hoping she might consider sharing not just this land but a life with me. Joy bloomed within her, bright and unexpected. Are you proposing, Thomas? Inelegantly, perhaps, he admitted with a smile, but sincerely. She reached up to touch his face, marveling at how this man had entered her life at its darkest point and brought light back into it. People will talk, she warned, though her eyes danced with happiness. The sheriff and the widow, courting so soon after scandal. Let them, he replied, echoing his earlier sentiment. I've spent my life caring about justice, not gossip. His expression softened. What's your answer, Thea? In response, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as his good arm encircled her waist, drawing her against him. When they finally parted, both were breathless. I'll take that as a yes, he murmured against her hair. Yes, she confirmed, her heart fuller than she had ever thought possible. Though I think a proper courtship is in order, don't you, for propriety's sake? Thomas laughed, the sound warm in the gathering dusk. For propriety's sake, then. Though I warn you, my patience has limits. As does mine, she admitted with a smile. They remained on the land until the first stars appeared, planning their future with quiet joy. Thomas spoke of building a house with wide windows to capture the mountain view. Thea described gardens and perhaps, someday, children's laughter filling rooms yet to be constructed. By the time they rode back to town, a new peace had settled over Thea, not the false tranquility of hiding, but the genuine serenity of having found where she belonged. 6 months later, on a perfect spring morning, Theodora Zimmerman became Theodora Xavier in a simple ceremony at Redemption's church. The same organ she had once hidden behind now played joyful music as she walked down the aisle to where Thomas waited, handsome in a new suit, his face alight with love. The church was filled to capacity not with the curious or the judgmental, but with genuine well-wishers. Even Deputy Wilson, fully recovered from his wounds, stood proudly as Thomas's best man. As they exchanged vows, Thea thought of the journey that had brought them to this moment. From widow to bride, from suspicion to respect, from isolation to belonging, the path had been neither straight nor easy. Yet standing before this man who had first offered safety and then given love, she knew every step had led exactly where she was meant to be. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Pastor Mills declared. You may kiss your bride. Thomas didn't hesitate, drawing her into an embrace that spoke of promises kept and a future secured. The congregation erupted in applause as they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife. Later, at the reception held in the town square, Eugenia Hollister approached them with uncharacteristic humility. I want you both to know, she said, that Redemption is honored to have you. What you've done for this town, exposing corruption, bringing justice, we won't forget it. Thank you, Eugenia, Thea replied sincerely. As the mayor's wife moved away, Thomas leaned close to whisper in Thea's ear. Ready to leave whenever you are, Mrs. Xavier. The name sent a thrill through her. Eager to be alone with your wife, Sheriff. More than I can express in polite company, he confirmed, his eyes twinkling. They slipped away as the celebration continued, riding to their newly completed home on the land overlooking what was now called Liberty Creek. The house was everything they had planned, spacious yet cozy, with windows that captured the majestic view of mountains and prairie. As Thomas carried her across the threshold, Thea felt the last shadows of her past finally lift. This was her beginning, their beginning written not in sorrow or suspicion, but in the language of second chances and enduring love. Welcome home, Thea, Thomas murmured, setting her gently on her feet in their front room. Home, she repeated, looking up at the man who had found her hiding and shown her how to stand tall again. Yes, this is exactly that. In the years that followed, Redemption continued to grow and prosper. Thomas Xavier remained its sheriff, respected for his fairness and unwavering commitment to justice. Thea established a successful dressmaking business, her designs sought after throughout the territory. Their home on Liberty Creek expanded to accommodate their growing family, first a son with his father's blue eyes, then twin daughters who inherited their mother's quiet strength. The land that had once been part of a corrupt scheme became a place of joy and laughter. The dark history of its acquisition transformed by the love of the family who now called it home. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Thomas and Thea would sit on their porch and watch the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. In those moments, they would remember how their story began with a widow hiding behind a church organ and a wounded sheriff who promised safety in a world that had offered none. Would you change anything? Thomas asked on one such evening, their hands intertwined as they had been since the day he had found her. Thea considered the question, thinking of all the pain and fear that had preceded their meeting. Then she looked at the home they had built, thought of the children sleeping inside, and felt the steady warmth of her husband's hand in hers. "Not a single moment," she answered truthfully. "Every step led me to you." And as darkness gently claimed the land around them, they remained together on the porch, two people who had found in each other not just safety, but the rarest gift of all, a love that had begun in whispers and grown strong enough to echo across a lifetime.